Welcome everybody to the final Next System speaker of 2025, of spring 2025. And it's really my very deep pleasure to welcome my colleague, Eleanor Finley, I should say Dr. Eleanor Finley, as of this past week, with a PhD in anthropology from the University of Massachusetts. Some of you who are in the room know that Dr. Finley is also the Director of Engaged Research and Action here at GMU with Next System Studies. You have a book that just came out, which you'll be speaking to on Practicing Social Ecology. For those of you who are watching this as a recorded video or who are elsewhere, just want to let you know that that Eleanor is on tour and giving book talks in different parts of the country, and so you should be looking for those as well. We met a couple of years ago through your work with municipalism.org, which is a project of the Solidarity Research Center, and through the Institute for Social Ecology. You have a background that goes back a long ways here in Northern Virginia with organizing, community organizing, student organizing, the Occupy movement, but also in particular with working with people who've been working to build, alternatives to the current system internationally. I should say that Dr. Finley's done extensive empirical research overseas. I think I'll be speaking to that directly today. So just really want to thank you for taking time out of what's a very busy time for you and for many people in the room as we get ready for the Democratizing Nova Summit this coming weekend to share your thoughts and your work with those who are gathered here today. So please welcome Dr. Finley.
Thank you, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here. I had a chance to talk, I guess 2 years ago now, to the Next System Fellows, and to this day, it's like one of my favorite talks that I've ever done because of GMU students. I grew up in this area. I grew up in Arlington, and I went to Virginia Commonwealth University for my undergrad. I'll spare you like all of the details of my biography, but I ended up moving away for a very long time and then recently coming back to Northern Virginia. And it's just been so moving and exciting to see transformative ideas taking root here. And again, like GMU students, you guys are just like the highlight of being a part of George Mason and Next System Studies. So thank you so much for welcoming me today. I'm going to talk about social ecology and a book that I wrote called Practicing Social Ecology. Social ecology can't really be fully explained and described in a 30 to 40 minute talk. So what I'm really going to do is kind of just throw a lot of provocative things at you and talk about the book and how I structured it the way I did, why I structured it the way I did, and try to give you just like a taste of what these ideas are all about. And hopefully that will give you some inspiration to look at further sources. You'll see here, I use a lot of pictures in my presentations. I'm happy to give out slides. And I like that folks can go and do further research because a lot of what these ideas are about is making connections between various struggles, perspectives, historical movements, and ideas. So I won't have time to explain everything in as much depth as I would like, but please see this as like again, kind of like a little bit of a sampler. So I titled this talk "A Next System in the Works" because social ecology is a movement that has been thinking about system change for a long time. Really, the language of social ecology in this sense that I'm using it comes out of the 1960s and the New Left movement, and also very early iterations of radical ecology. So these are folks who are thinking through the problem of capitalism and nature, starting really in the mid-century when very early issues like acid rain were developing. And social ecology is really an attempt to think holistically about the natural crisis that we're in, the planetary crisis we're in, and the social crisis that we're in, and the ways in which they're overlapped. I think these days we have a pretty intuitive sense that they're deeply overlapped. But when these ideas were being formulated, and I'll just...
I can be your slide.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's go next one. When these ideas were being formulated, this was like a really radical proposition. There's a guy here on the left, or on the sort of the top left corner, named Murray Bookchin. He's largely credited as the main theorist behind social ecology. But as I try to show in my book and in my work, he's not the only one. That these notions were percolating in various corners of the world. We see them bubbling up all the time, and I'll sort of get to that. But so when we talk about the social ecology movement, at least certainly what I discuss in my book, I'm sort of thinking about the milieu that was around Murray in the time that he was writing these ideas. And what Murray was really getting at is that the ecological crisis that we're in today stems from a crisis of social hierarchy, and that the notion of dominating nature stems from the very real domination of people over one another, right? So there's a lot to unpack in that statement. One is that the notion of dominating nature is just a notion. We can't dominate nature. We can destroy our natural surroundings, but we can't dominate nature itself. That's one. Another is that the domination of human by human is very real, and that systems of domination lie at the root of the ecological crisis, and not just capitalism alone. That's another really important critique that goes into social ecology. Our economic system is crucial in the current crisis that we're in, but it's not the only source of domination. And in many ways, capitalism is kind of a capstone on a lot of other forms of domination, like colonization, women's oppression, the state, ableism, many other kinds of isms that go into creating the capitalist system. So, as I mentioned, social ecology is really getting formulated by Murray and the folks around him in the 1960s, the 1970s. And in the mid-1970s, a group of students coming out of the New Left came together to form an institute at Goddard College. It's called the Institute for Social Ecology. That's where most of these photographs were taken. And this Goddard College is located in central Vermont. So Murray started his life in New York. He's very much an urban activist, came out of the Marxist left. He's born to Marxist parents and grandparents, but then became very disturbed by the Soviet Union and what was happening under Stalin. And like many folks at this time were rethinking, okay, wait a second, what do we mean by socialism? What is the role of authoritarianism in making socialism go awry? And but in the 1970s, there was the institute being established, and it was drawing folks from New York City, from those conversations around Marxism, but it was also tying into feminist currents. The term ecofeminism, disputed if it's like, who was the very first person to use the term ecofeminism? But it's undeniable that the paradigm of ecofeminism was developed in many ways at the Institute. There was an ecofeminism class in the early 1970s. There were folks coming from the Lower East Side of Manhattan to do this work. There's an activist and poet named Slimma over on the left. And that image, who is a part of the 11th Street movement in the Lower East Side. So these are major squatting mobilizations that are led by people of color, largely Black folks and also Puerto Rican. And they took over abandoned lots and blocks that really had just been completely devastated by negligent landlords. And in the 1970s, they made the Lower East Side into a very green sort of paradise. That's just maybe a strong word, but it was a very utopian movement. And those folks were coming and going from the Institute. And there were also indigenous folks in this milieu as well. I have a photo here of a really wonderful theorist named John Mohawk, who's a part of the Seneca Nation. And these principles of democracy and federation that social ecology is structured around were deeply inspired by folks like John and other indigenous movements. So in the book that I wrote, I wanted to capture that social ecology is not just something that was happening in the 1970s or 1980s. It's also something that's happening today. It's a growing movement. There's a lot of interest in Bookchin's work, but also this paradigm of thinking through the relationship between ecological liberation and social liberation. And then what are the political forms that are implied by that liberation? That's a really critical piece here, is thinking through what are the political institutions. If we see that the state becomes oppressive, even if we try to undo capitalism, the state remains incredibly oppressive, which is what we saw in the Soviet Union, various other sort of state socialist experiments. What are the political forms that we can turn to? And so that's really at the core of this movement. I like to throw up lots of pictures just to kind of give folks a sense of the flavor of what I'm talking about. On the right here, I have a meme that's related to Google Murray Bookchin. Has anybody ever heard the phrase Google Murray Bookchin? Have you ever heard that? And you're like, it's like, so like in Left Book, even Left Book is a thing of the past a little bit now. But when Facebook was really up and coming, and people were organizing there a lot, sharing ideas a lot, there's this meme that came up that said Google Murray Bookchin, and it was like, he will change your whole perspective on life. And it was often very humorous and fun. And yet I noticed that there wasn't a lot of newer writing that explained what these ideas were actually about. And people shouldn't just have to Google something in order to understand it. There should be more materials that are accessible. So that really motivated me to write this book. Down there on the left is a sort of panorama of the Institute, and up top here is a photo from the Institute for Social Ecology in recent years, but it's in a magazine from an activist from India who came to the Institute and brought back what he learned and was really excited to share it with his communities. And there's a really vibrant people's movement there that are also working with these ideas and are also coming from those ideas from their own language, from their own indigenous perspective. So I wanted to capture that. Am I already, how do I get out of time so quickly? I wanted to capture that, so I wrote this book. Go find it. You can order it on Amazon. I would recommend going through the publisher Pluto Press, but you can also order it to independent bookstores. It's at the GMU library if you want to just check it out from the library. Yeah, so I wrote a book about it. And first, I wanted to break down the core ideas of social ecology. I've touched on them here a little bit, but I wrote various sections of the book on these concepts, one being first and second nature. And what we mean by that in social ecology is that we don't just have nature and society, right, as these dualistic, static, opposed entities. Really, when we look at natural and social evolution, is that we have something much more like a first and second nature. And what that means is that society, human society, is an organic outgrowth from the natural world. We exist within the natural world. We are a part of the natural world. This table is a really great example, although it's not wood, it's particle board. But we're making a new reality, really a world out of the material and also in many ways immaterial basis of nature or first nature. But second nature is qualitatively different. Society has qualitatively new dimensions, and human beings, even though we are a product of natural evolution, including our minds and including our desire for freedom, our belief in justice and fairness, our desire to do what's right. All of those things are a part of nature. And yet we have qualitatively new capacities to adapt the natural world into, again, sort of make a world of our own. Other principles, hierarchy and non-hierarchy. It sounds like you guys have been talking about some of these ideas already in the fellows, so you've got sort of an intuitive grasp of them. Another critical concept in social ecology is post-scarcity, which is the notion that we already live in a condition where we don't have to be struggling working 50 hours a week, and that actually the level of technological advancement that we have today could yield a society that's where most of our time is spent on leisure. And at the same time, that those technologies don't have to be ecologically destructive. And so again, in the 1970s, this was mind-blowing to folks, right? Especially like in the old, like you think about hippies, or like they reject technology outright. But this is a proposition that technology can be liberatory. And then finally, direct democracy federations. I'll let that one alone for now. I don't know how much time we're thinking. 20 minutes? Yeah. Oh, okay, then I'm fine. Yeah. Then I'm fine. Okay, good. I'm just, the clock is right in front of me, so I'm like staring at it in the face. Finally, another question that I wanted to tackle in the book was, what does the praxis of social ecology look like? A lot of what's been published about social ecology is very philosophical. If you read Bookchin's work, it's very dense. He's talking about Aristotle, he's talking about Adorno. He's very fluent in revolutionary theory. It's dense, it can be kind of meandering, and a lot of folks find it challenging, and understandably so. So it's the existing literature is very theoretical. And I noticed there wasn't as much written about, well, what's the practice of these politics? And then furthermore, what have we learned from that practice? And I'm sure Ben has, talked to you about the notion of praxis, right? Which is that we have theory and analysis. I even think theory is almost a trivializing word, right? We have our analysis, and we use that to enact upon the world. And what happens is inevitably different than what we imagine. And then we learn from that and we develop new theory. So I wanted to get a sense of what have we learned over the last 5-6 decades of social ecology practice. That was another sort of key motivation in the book that I try to get at. Next slide. Okay. So what I found was that you could largely break social ecology practice into 4 areas. Again, I'm breaking this down into pieces, which is not particularly dialectical. I know there are social ecologists who I'm sure don't like some of the ways this book was written because it's chopping things up as opposed to being synthetic. But I wanted to write something that ordinary people could understand. And you didn't necessarily have to have a degree in Next System Studies in order to be able to grasp it. So I broke the book down into various chapters relating to reconciliation and reharmonization of the fissures and alienation that domination has caused across these areas, starting with the personal and the interpersonal, so meaning between people, also the intrapersonal, meaning within ourselves, Activists often refer to that as internal work. And what we mean by that is just like basically learning how to not be crazy so that you can be in movements. It's like the hard, everybody, I'm sure anybody hears what activists can say like that's a really important part of the work. This is also something very generational. Like 2 generations ago, people had not, I think, as sophisticated a grasp on what it means to do, healing, and, really sort of deeply thinking about what it means to think and act in non-hierarchical ways and what it means to dismantle the ideology of capitalism internally. So that's the first chapter. And it's also very critical because it sets up everything else that we do. Next is building ecological communities. So social ecology is really centrally committed to the reconciliation of nature and society. And part of what that means is changing the physical infrastructure of the world that we live in. Often when people get introduced to social ecology, it's just through the lens of direct democracy. And we think, okay, we're going to snap our fingers, have a direct democracy, and suddenly everything's going to work out. It's absolutely untrue. One, because people are often mentally not prepared to be democratic with each other, and we're a part of that. We have to learn those democratic skills. And also the infrastructure of our society is completely alienated. I think in Northern Virginia, we have probably one of the most difficult terrains in that regard. That's something that I think about like all day, every day. Transportation, housing, we're really being strangled to death by cars. And so social ecology is about transforming physical infrastructures so that they facilitate social and therefore political infrastructures and outcomes. So getting into that political infrastructure, social ecology is talking about popular assemblies. And what we mean by that is people who live in a given area coming together to make decisions about the issues that impact everyday life collectively. So this isn't about deciding what couch you get to put in your living room. It's about what we do with the sewer systems. It's about what we do with the roads. It's about how do we direct our resources regarding hospitals or schools. So all of the things that make collective life possible should be democratized as much as possible. And again, this relates to dramatic reconfiguration of our spatial landscape. Murray Bookchin wrote extensively about municipalities in the history of civic life and the development of cities. And he really saw a dual development in the urbanization of our world, where we have cities that are decentralized and organic in their growth. And we also have cities that are profoundly inorganic and often associated with domination, right? And again, we can imagine this just, the grid of modern, quote unquote, modern city today versus like the winding streets of an older city. And it's no accident that we find older cities to be much more pleasant to be in because they're built for people. Whereas, as we know today, cities on a logic of domination are built for the power systems. And so popular assemblies are about bringing people together on that human scale and making collective decisions using consensus or using other modes. Something I found as I was doing research for this book and as I've matured as an activist, but also done some anthropological work, is that there are really like an infinite variety of ways of conducting assemblies. They're all kind of the same. It's just people coming together, make decisions. You have a facilitator. But in terms of like procedure or decision making, like what actually counts as democratic on the nitty-gritty level, there's no magic formula. What it's actually really about is, do the people in the room trust each other? Do they have patience? Do they have the time to sit there? And what is the, that goes back to the internal work. What's the social groundwork that's gone into the convening? And popular assemblies really appear all over the planet and all throughout history. You have to dig for it sometimes, but we see them time and again in human history, and going all the way back to our earliest history, right? There's evidence for popular assemblies in the Fertile Crescent, Neolithic Mesopotamia. Again, going back to like the earliest known settlements, there's evidence for these political forms. And then finally, social ecology is not just about having isolated communities that are making decisions amongst themselves. This is a global movement. We're talking about a next system, not just people who are focused on their own individual lives. And there is a connection between the interdependence between people and then the interdependence between communities. So in social ecology, we often talk about democratic confederalism, which I think we'll have a couple slides on in a second. But that federal principle of interdependence, the interdependence between society and nature, between organisms and an ecosystem, also applies between communities. And in federations, what we're trying to do is, instead of having representatives, like how we have today, that we have delegates. And delegates are recallable. I think I have a slide about that in a moment. But we don't just elect so-and-so who then gets to vote however they want. They're beholden to the assembly and their decisions. So it's at least theoretically. I wasn't sure if I wanted to put in this slide, but I threw it in anyway. Again, I wanted to show the development of these ideas after Murray Bookchin's life. These are three sort of main examples. Bookchin and his milieu were very involved in the Green Movement, which I think is like, this relationship is a natural expression of that relationship through time, where there was the Green Movement that then became the Green Party and the Left Green Movement. Murray died in 2006. Since then, there's been a municipalist movement in Southern Europe, largely, but in many different places, including Latin America, other parts of Northern Europe. And that language of municipalism is about centering politics at the municipality and transforming institutions of municipal governance, right? So when Murray in particular wrote about popular assemblies, he also wasn't just thinking people coming together on the street. He was interested in how those movements can take over city halls, neighborhood councils, and how we can really seize power and create a political sphere that is popular and participatory. So folks have been waging various experiments in that realm in Southern Europe. This is a picture of a politician named Ada Colau in Barcelona. I think it's debatable at this point whether you can call Ada Colau a municipalist, but she comes out of that movement. And in Barcelona, which is a very organic city, there's lots of little neighborhoods and pockets. There have been lively assembly movements going back to the Francoist period, and even before that, to the Spanish Civil War. And then finally, and this is really a major event, there's the Rojava Revolution from roughly 2012 to the present day, where Kurdish people in northern Syria, out of the Syrian civil war, pushed out the Assad regime and said, we want a system of democratic confederalism that is ecological, that is feminist, that is multicultural. And they're really asserting a paradigm that is life-affirming, against very oppressive forces in the region. Next slide. I think I sort of covered a lot of this already. Again, I want to just show some images about first and second nature. In the book, I talk about permaculture networks quite a bit, and again, sort of changing the infrastructure. I interviewed this activist, Lisa DiPiano, who has a fascinating history in the anti-globalization movement, going from like fierce street protests to then becoming a really important figure in the permaculture movement in New England in the 1990s, early 2000s. We can move on from this one. Again, I think I touched on this, but I wanted to flag in the book that these ideas have parallels in Indigenous worldviews. And Bookchin, writing in the 1970s and 80s, was particularly influenced by anthropologists who are writing about Indigenous peoples and also Indigenous thinkers themselves. And so I think this is really crucial because a lot of what makes social ecology unique, in my mind, is ultimately coming from Indigenous people and perspectives. Ahead. I sort of brought up, post-scarcity. I love images that gives a sense of where we're at. But there's actually some really cool traces of social ecology in science fiction. If you've ever read The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, she was inspired by Bookchin and social ecology when she writes about the planet Anarchos. And in Star Trek, Captain Jean-Luc Picard has this really great quote that really summarizes a post-scarcity perspective, where he says the acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity. So Star Trek is an example of a post-scarcity society, or an imagination of a post-scarcity society. Like, what are we able to accomplish once we've stopped manufacturing scarcity? So the other sort of the flip side of the fact that we could be in a post-scarcity society is that scarcity is manufactured today. It has to be enforced, and it has to be created through repression, but also through the creation of desires, right? Consumerist culture, we're constantly throwing stuff away. Our clothes are made of plastic. And so this wastefulness at the core of the ecological crisis, again, it's a social crisis. It's not that we can't have nice things. It's not that we can't feed 7 or 8 billion people on the planet. It's that we live in an economy that's entirely structured around manufacture and maintaining scarcity, while at the same time constantly overproducing. So you can do next slide. So yeah, direct democracy. So I'm skipping around a little bit. Back to the praxis in the Rojava Revolution, they have really prioritized women's liberation and seeing women as they see it, as women as the first colony, right? So the emergence of domination comes from the domination of women. There's actually a debate about that, where hierarchy comes from. But it's indisputable that women are absolutely central to anything like a democratic system thriving. Really, if you look at any democratic movement over time, there's women at the center. And by women, I also include non-binary folks and anyone facing gender repression, right? Because again, these are political categories. And in Rojava, they have a co-chair system, which means that every political office or administrative office is held by a man and a woman jointly, which is shocking for many people. And I think is really interesting. I think we in the West kind of tend to gloss over this one, but I think it would be fascinating to see what if we had a man and woman in every single leadership position, and how would that change the outcomes in organizations, in cities, in governance. There's, again, a relational approach in this movement. In Rojava, the political system is, I think, really kind of a hybrid between these grassroots politics and a state system. And if we had more time, we could go into discussing that. But they really face a tremendous amount of violence and pressure from the outside. So they've formed popular militia units, but then there's a more professionalized sort of apparatus for dealing with the security situation. So there's a lot of diversity within the Rojava Revolution, and including community assemblies and women's assemblies in many areas. There are many ways that they've worked to bring women into the political sphere. There's also a 50% women's quota on every assembly. So if you don't meet that, none of the decisions are actually binding. So you go to next slide. Yeah, I kind of touched on this a little bit. I maybe should have set this one a little bit earlier, but that's fine. The Rojava Revolution has been a major upheaval in the region, and I think a major turning point for the left globally, right? It's the Zapatista uprising in 1994, and the paradigm that has come since that initial uprising, I think in many ways was like the first one. And in Rojava, we're seeing that it can happen again in a very different context. And it's also a much larger territory. There are about 4 million people living in northeast Syria, and they've had this system going for now more than 10 years. And they've done so under, again, very, very challenging circumstances, with ISIS to the south, Turkey to the north, the Assad regime to the west, and there's a diaspora movement in the mix here too. My own research was with activists who are living in diaspora in Europe. It's an image here called Campo Labrio in Greece. And this is a self-managed autonomous refugee camp that is not run by the Greek state. And if you have experience or exposure to the European refugee system, it's extremely repressive and top-down. People are put in camps; they're not allowed to leave. And this camp is a really inspiring. It's an example of how people can really manage their own lives. The next slide. In Rojava, another critical piece other than women's liberation is also a multicultural aspect to it, right? And I think there's a lesson here about being actively multicultural, which means not just saying, oh, we just have diversity and we're all equal. It's actually about recognizing how we're all very different. And they worked very hard to bring people to the table on their own terms. Again, there are contradictions here. Many communities in the region have differing views on women's rights, for example, or, I know in some regions polygamy is practiced, and there've been a lot of conflicts over whether those communities should be allowed to maintain those rules, or where do human rights and cultural relativism meet. But this principle of having a truly multicultural society where we're not just having a blanket blank sense of equality, but a really active living embodied sense of diversity is also very much a part of the praxis of these politics, particularly in Rojava. All right, touched on some of this earlier, and I think actually we're pretty close to wrapping up. The last sort of practice I identified was federations. That one's harder to look at, right? Because they're revolutionary movements that swell up and then go back down. If you are the kind of person who have an opportunity to see federal meetings in action, you're very lucky. I mentioned the notion of delegation instead of representation. This is really what it kind of hinges on. I did find that when I interviewed folks who'd been a part of building up federations, particularly in Barcelona, that that distinction between delegation and representation isn't always as clean or as clear as we would like. So I think there's a lot of really interesting theoretical and imperial work to be done about thinking through our conceptual tools relating to power. I think that our language about democracy and participation is very dull, and our tools are not sharp enough. Our tools are very rudimentary, and I think what the future is going to look like in these ideas is really getting clearer, sharper understandings conceptually of what is going on as people share power, and what are different ways that people share power. And then lastly, in social ecology, we talk about dual power. I don't talk about this as much in the book. I touch on it, but it's worth mentioning, which is that social ecology isn't, again, just a static system. It's also a theory of how do we create a next system? How do we take this world and build something much more liberatory? And in social ecology, we talk about creating a contest of popular legitimacy between popular movements and the existing system. So what that means is we're not talking about an insurrection or just a single revolutionary moment. We're talking about a slow process where we're working with everyday people, which is something I love. Something I love about the Next System movement, because it's really taking that critical approach, and inhabiting institutions that already have some of that legitimacy, right? So if we're looking at going into city halls, if we popularize the politics around municipal institutions and city halls, we will have control over things like the schools and the hospitals and the roads. There will already be that element of popular legitimacy. A dual power approach often implies working with a minimum transitional and maximum program. So in social ecology activism, folks talk about, when we're working on campaigns, we're thinking about the short term, the medium term, and the long term, right? So this doesn't mean we can't engage in reform work, but it means how are we thinking through, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and then finally, what does this issue look like in a revolutionary society? And again, Next System Studies has done a lot of work around these ideas. And then lastly, I'll flag that in social ecology and libertarian municipalism, which is Bookchin's language for these ideas, we also talk about engaging in elections, but not to run candidates and get them into office, but rather to spread the word about popular democracy. And ultimately, at least in theory, and this part has not been as many experiments as we would like, but in theory, dissolving the office of a given elected official into the popular assembly. That was Murray's idea about how that transition would happen. So there's a lot more to say there, but which is to say this isn't about electing activists into office, although there's a lot of debate about that and the merits of different approaches. So I think we're done. I know it's the European Municipalist Network, really cool stuff. But I think we're probably good on time. Parallels of Black liberation, anti-colonial struggles are also part of this that I talk about in the book that's important. So one more slide. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go back to visual here. And we have people who are joining us online, but we also have people in the room. So the practice has been to start with people in the room, and we'll do a round in the room, and then we'll open it up to those of you who are elsewhere. And I will keep an eye out for the for comments in the chat. And so for those of you who are at home or at work or sitting in a park somewhere, what you can do is just raise your hand, and we'll keep an eye out for that as well. Thank you. And you feel free to pick on people. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start from the left. Aaron.
So I had a particular interest on, though it was brief, your slide on the parallels with indigenous perspectives. Mm-hmm. And I was interested in that because last semester I took an anthropology class, I think it was environmental anthropology. And one of the very first things we discussed was incorporating like different perspectives, specifically indigenous perspectives, into how we approached environmental concerns. And related to this, we also discussed the topic of ethnography. And I guess to get to my point is taking that into account, I want to know your thoughts on how we can take indigenous perspectives and incorporate them into how we approach the issue of climate change and climate crises.
Yeah, so that's a huge, there's probably so many ways to do that. I'm trying to think of ones where I can be really concrete and concise. Specifically in regards to climate change. I mean, first in regards to climate change, we have to acknowledge that we have a responsibility to this planet, right? And to the non-human beings in this planet. And I think that's a lot of when indigenous communities come together to fight pipelines, to fight new initiatives. It's not just on the basis of, hey, you're hurting us and our communities, but also we're intervening because we have a responsibility to steward this planet. And I think social ecology touches on that. Although really the seriousness of that responsibility has emerged from movements more recently. You know, we're really starting to understand that like this is life and death for people and for our non-human I would say siblings on this earth. That's one. I think another is, you know, it also depends on what we mean by we, right? Because there's we as this, you know, social movements, and then there's we as, you know, this society at large. I think we as social movements can really do more to honor Indigenous folks by acknowledging the pre-colonial and anti-colonial geographies in the region, right? We often take colonial geographies for granted. And I include myself in this, right? This is something I try to remind myself about. But, you know, these questions about land and what was this land before colonization, and not just taking for granted that we're going to have the same geographies, the same names for things, and even the same kinds of ownership, right? Those are really critical, right? I think the land back movement is something that we should be really, you know, working closely with. And again, it depends on what we mean by we in that case. I'm going to go next. We have a lot of hands. Go next. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi, my name is Kat.
Nice to meet you.
So I want to explore what you brought up about direct democracy and power structures. I have found in my own conversations, it is very difficult to explain the differences to people who aren't in Next System Studies.
Yeah.
And very recently, I was trying to explain the difference between hierarchical and horizontal power structures, and literally had someone tell me, well, horizontal structures just don't work. And I'm like, well, they do, but like could not comprehend. And so from your research and experience, what, I don't know if I want to ask, what are the biggest challenges, or how would you address the challenges in explaining or trying to get people to grasp the necessity for greater direct democracy and for subverting the hierarchical power structures into a more horizontal structure so that you can have greater participation?
Yeah. So this is $1 million question, right? Because if we could convince folks of this easily, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. So I think one is it's a longer process for folks to come into that learning, to understand that other ways of life are possible. And I think also, and I'll give two helpful insights, is one is that we actually operate in a horizontal, non-coercive way more often than we realize, right? Right now, we're doing it right now, right? And so we think that we're in a hierarchical society, but like there's no police officer holding a, like saying, you students, you have to be here, or, and often it's very, it gets complicated and muddled because to take the education example, a lot of students are like, well, I have to go to school to get a job, right? But in fact, people struggle for generations to get their kids to school because education is a good in its own right. So I think it takes time, but we can help folks understand that actually a lot of what we do on a day-to-day basis is not based on coercion, or doesn't have to be. So that's one, is sort of in some ways lifting the veil of like what is actually going on. And I would actually encourage you to read Murray on some of this stuff because he talks about this really extensively, like the cosmology of domination, that we live in a society where our entire worldview is structured around a dominating worldview. We read domination into everything, including nature. He talks about this a lot, that we see domination in nature, lion, the king of beasts, blah, blah, blah. So this is a cosmology and way of seeing the world. So we aren't going to let go of it easily. Another useful insight that I found is, and for myself in my own thinking too, is thinking through the difference between hierarchy and status, right? Mm-hmm. And so hierarchy, again, has an element of violence, whereas status does not. And often status is earned, right? So you see this in indigenous cultures and political systems a lot, right? It's not that there aren't people who receive a lot of respect and when they're talking, everybody else is quiet. But it's often earned through time and through character. And again, it's non-coercive. They don't have the ability to tell everybody else what to do, or they're gonna, or there's gonna be dire consequences. But it's rather like we listen to this person because they're the, they're pretty smart, And again, these aren't black and white. It's often on a spectrum. But another piece of status is that it's temporary. Right. So like a teacher standing up in front of a classroom and, giving instructions to a classroom is not hierarchical inherently, because once you leave the classroom, like Ben can't like tell you like, go get me a glass of water, like it's a temporary relationship. And then again, even within that, there's different styles, of that relationship. But, we have to give children instructions, for example. And sometimes you have to pick a child, sometimes a child wants them, you have to pick them up. And they don't like that, but it's a temporary arrangement. And again, it's not backed by the threat of violence. So thinking through status and hierarchy and understanding hierarchy as permanent systems of command and obedience based on a threat of violence. Right. So when we talk about police coming to your house because there's a domestic dispute or someone's having a mental health crisis, right? That's a hierarchical system. Putting someone in a prison, that's a hierarchical system. So yeah, those are just two brief things, but there's a lot there about how do we get folks on board? Yeah.
I'm wondering, because there's maybe about 12 minutes, if you take a couple, let's take everybody in the room here, and then you can respond, then we can see what people at home have. If that works. I'll help you keep track of it.
Okay. Raise your hands high. Okay. Okay. All right. Here, and here. That's the order I saw, folks.
And speak up too.
Okay. So in class, when we read your reading, one thing that really stuck to me and something that we've been talking about is finding new avenues and forms for people to encounter with city officials and really participate within, the changes being made around their community. And in your presentation, you mentioned the differences between representation and delegation. And I think you kind of alluded, but for the sake of time kind of passed through it, but you're talking about the debate of delegation of activists versus the actual people or people that specialists, whatever. Mm-hmm. What do you think, I guess, how do you navigate that kind of debate or conversation of like, do we put the people that like know kind of how to navigate this system of like public participation, or do we put the people that are directly affected or have experience within?
Yeah, I don't have a clear-cut answer on this question because I think I think of it as like a whole realm of experimentation. And that's how I talk about it in the book. And actually, an activist from Barcelona gave me this really wonderful, I'm responding to everybody.
Why you finish with this one? Yeah, that's right.
Give me this wonderful metaphor called like the playa, like the beach. And he talks about the waves of social movements crashing against the sand of institutions, and how like the sand seems hard and it seems solid, but the waves over time can erode the sand and move the sand. But the waves are very permeable. Like we have social movements, they come up and then they crash and they recede again. And so that metaphor has been really helpful for me for thinking through again this kind of like this realm, to use an ecological term in ecotone, which is where two ecosystems come together. We're talking about a realm of experimentation. And again, there's a lot of debate, and like this is the stuff that movements come together and fall apart over. My sense is that we do ourselves a big disservice if we just stop at electing activists into office, which is where a lot of movements stop. They don't get to the popular participation, like, hey, we're talking about ordinary people having access to power and voting and making, a radically participatory movement. This isn't just about electing activists into office. So that's where I fall on the spectrum. But I do think it's useful to have people, especially right now where we're at in movements, like I think folks who are involved in city halls is really important. That's why I think we do need to create moments of encounter between people who are in city halls, but also like there might be tensions that arise. And when they do, my biases are always with ordinary people. Like having a managerial, liberal, social democratic system doesn't interest me. But there's lots of debates in there. I'm going to go to the one in the back, and I'm going to try to get to folks.
Yeah, no, I appreciate him. I really loved your lecture. It's been great. And I feel like you've hit a lot of these points. I think my question is going to be kind of similar to what has been asked so far. But one thing that I thought about is as this movement grows and as people get elected into offices and as these things come about, what are some ways that we can keep ecology, feminism, and these other important values continuing in these offices? And you mentioned this a little bit in your responses, but I guess I just want to reiterate the question.
Yeah. I've got a pen in it, and we'll do two more.
This is more of a question for you as someone who knows more about the history in the region, but I was just wondering what you see as the future of democratic and federalism, or however you say it, in Rojava in the region, with the PKK changing things in Turkey and also the new Syrian regime.
Yeah.
Just a general outlook for you.
And then totally different from both of those. You mentioned at the beginning this idea that you can't really dominate nature, you can only dominate other people, and I wasn't sure I totally got that, so I was hoping you could elaborate on it some.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to kind of go backwards a little bit. So what we mean is that in you can't really dominate nature is that nature is we're little fish swimming in the fishbowl, and we're never going to be able to fashion the planet and the ecological and biosphere that we rely on. We're never going to be able to mold it to human desires. We're never going to be able to fully control it. Like, sure, we can tinker here and there. We can certainly destroy certain aspects of the natural world. But I think climate change is really like the example par excellence of this, is that there's a mentality with the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism that like we're going to rationalize nature and we're going to bring it under our control. And there are a lot of examples in agriculture, you know, of monoculture, for example, that we're just going to have a single crop because we want the highest yield possible for a given amount of land. And they're trying to control the land in that way. And yet what we see even just a few years later is that the soil is completely dead and depleted. So it's this hubris that makes us think that we can control the plants and the animals and the, you know, the living matter of the world. And what we're actually seeing is that systems of domination just end up killing the living order of the world. And we're not actually creating prosperity, right? Like, you know, going back to the industrial revolution in agriculture, like they, you know, the original ideas around this and ideology around this is like, oh, we're going to produce so much, we're going to have such high yields, you know, or chemical fertilizer, for example. Now they don't even pretend. Now they're just like, oh, this is what you have to do. You want to eat, peasant? You know, this is what we have to do. And so the idea that we can dominate nature, you know, this idea that, or techno capitalism, or what's it, green capitalism, right? Like, oh, we can have carbon trading. Like, no, carbon trading has done nothing. And this idea that we can, you know, that human beings can control the biosphere is just, it's a fantasy and it's killing the planet. Whereas people dominating and controlling each other is where that sort of originates from. Is that clarifying? I hope. Yeah. Okay. All right. I don't know. It's so hard. It's so hard to say. I mean, I don't have a clear like opinion of the peace declaration that. So to give folks context, Abdullah Öcalan, the sort of de facto philosophical leader of the Kurdish movement and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, declared, wanting to have a disarmament of the PKK. And folks are very divided over this question. But it also comes in the context of a new regime in Damascus. I can say that given my knowledge of the situation and being in communique with folks on the ground, that I have and we should have absolutely no trust at all for the regime in Damascus. That the liberal establishment right now that's going along with saying like, oh, they've reformed themselves, like is that's a recipe for genocide. So things are very, very precarious right now. Folks in Rojava are in the position of having to trade pieces of their autonomy or women's rights, right? And, in order to be a part of the new Syria. And yet being what it really means to be part of the new Syria is just, we're not going to come kill you. We're not going to team up with Turkey to absolutely squash you. So it's very precarious. I don't have great insight. I think that the disarmament of the PKK might be an interesting way to bring some support to Rojava. But it's hard to say. I mean, I do think we want peace, and I think that Öcalan in particular has pushed for the democratization of the Turkish state, often when other people don't want to, but I think that that's often been a wise choice, right? Especially because this isn't about Kurds versus Turks. This is about a paradigm of non-domination versus a paradigm of domination. So I think there's some hope there, but it's so challenging and it's so complicated. And obviously my language skills are limited. I have like pieces of Kurdish and Turkish here and there, but there's.
And I'm wondering, just because we have one question online that ties in more closely to this, and then maybe we could end with the last one. Here, Art asks, I know Öcalan has repeatedly called for the youth to form assemblies and participate in self-governance. Do you have a sense of how much of that has happened, Rojava?
I mean, I think quite a lot by and large. Young people, you see young people all the time, every day in the political system. They're participating in the co-chair system. They're in the municipalities. But I don't know about this specific call from Öcalan. about bringing in youth. I know that that's broadly a part of the paradigm and again, is broadly successful, but I haven't heard of it as like a sticking point or an issue that hasn't been happening as much as we would hope.
And then there was John's question about ecology, feminism, and sort of core
Yeah.
programmatic.
Yeah, and that's sort of getting back to sort of the municipal standpoint. So what time do we end?
In 2 minutes.
And oh, okay, cool. Clearly we'll solve this in 2 minutes. So one is, so you mentioned like electing folks into office. And again, I kind of want to push back on that notion because I think it's a tactic, you know, but it's not the end. It's not the goal. So I think when we're talking about, you know, okay, we get somebody into office, we get somebody in City Hall, we can't really expect, especially from our current standpoint, we can't necessarily expect them to maintain those systems. So part of it, I think, is that we always have to have a strong base outside of political institutions, right? So we're thinking about like the metaphor of the beach, you know, like our weight has to be outside of political institutions. And this is part of like, you see Democrats coming in again and again and again to absorb all of the energy of social movements and, you know, and look where we are. So I think that's one is like, we always have to know that anything where we're like dipping our hand into city halls, into institutions, especially at this early juncture, is like, you know, it could all get taken away. So that's one. But in terms of like, okay, so that we have some degree of control over, you know, the system. We're talking about a post-revolutionary society. I think the co-chair system in Rojava works well. I think quorums work well. But also I think this is like very much like the question of popular democratic movements, you know, and let's say here in what is currently the United States, like we're going to have to invent for ourselves, like what does it mean to have real autonomy and participation for our various communities? What does it mean to have reparation for, you know, for racism and for wealth, racialized wealth inequality? Like, what does that look like for us? Those are going to be long discussions and questions that emerge over time. And I look forward to having them with everyone.